Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner. And announcing FNMC Presents, an album of previous commissions and competition winners performed by members of the Flute New Music Consortium. Repertoire includes works by Sean O'Pebolo, Joseph Hallman, Becca Sims, Cherie Slider, and others. Purchase a copy today. All proceeds go directly to FNMC. Flute New Music Consortium, Inc. is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your contributions are tax deductible to the extent allowed by the law. Visit www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com for details. Dr. Anne-Marie Guzzo is a Wyoming-based composer who draws on science and nature, playful absurdism, and interdisciplinary collaboration to create music that has been described as alternately moving and humorous. Anne has recently collaborated with vertical dancers, a geologist, a rangeland ecologist, a painter, and a microbiologist, among others. She also founded and directs the Wyoming Festival, New Music in the Mountains, a chamber music festival in Grand Teton National Park at the UW National Park Service Research Station. And until recently, she was composition faculty with me at the University of Wyoming. Annie, hi. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to share a little background beyond the bio from our intro as well, because you grew up in Laramie. Was your dad was a chemistry professor? Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then you went away to school and came back in 1999, right?
Correct.
Starting part-time, working in various areas on campus until UW finally created a full-time position for you.
Correct.
And so I'm curious to delve into your origin story a little bit. This is fascinating to me, because I came from a more urban place, right? And then found myself professionally in Laramie, and you've done the exact opposite. What was it like growing up in Laramie in the 70s and 80s?
It was actually a wonderful place to grow up in. I have some dear friends that are chemistry, adjacent. So my dad had friends, and there's a big family called the Nelsons, and we just ran wild all of our childhood, and it was filled with creativity. That was like one of the things that was just really valued, even though our dads were both chemists. Everything was about being creative. So, for example, I think I've told you some of these stories, Nicole, and you can tell me if I have. The Nelsons and I they lived across the prairie, and we'd go dig a hole in the prairie so big it was like a swimming pool, and drag the hose across the street and fill it. It's super dangerous, and yet, 8 children playing around in the mud, having a glorious time, and completely red from Wyoming mud. And we also dragged a hose into the house, and we taped up one of the basement bedrooms with a tarp and duct tape and made a wading pool inside. We got in trouble for that one. But, we were constantly drawing and singing. I learned rounds from the Nelsons. We were constantly making music, listening to music, playing guitars and banjos, etc. So there was a kind of a glorious freedom to it, and tons of outdoor time. And as I think you'll see that influences my career, right? Or that influences the way I work to make music.
That sounds like a beautiful story, maybe of Laramie, and also of growing up in the 70s. Right. Because people would end up in jail for that now, right?
I know, exactly.
We were wonderfully unsupervised as kids.
But it allowed, especially in a small but university town, it allowed for a lot of intellectual curiosities to be satisfied, a lot of creativity, as I was saying. So we would run down to the dinosaur museum anytime we wanted and climb around Sue the T-Rex and look at the exhibits, the art museum, check out a rare book. And people were open to that back then.
You created a great segue for my next question a little bit earlier, because a look at your works list, at your catalog on your website, really drives the point home that you are a nature lover.
Yeah.
I guess it's impossible to say, but do you feel like the nature that you're writing about so often is the nature of your childhood? Do you think that comes from having grown up in Wyoming?
I definitely think it has a huge impact on it. I've lived in 3 different places throughout my career and life for the most part. A few other places, but mostly it was Laramie, Wyoming, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the Santa Cruz Bay Area, kind of general, between Davis and Santa Cruz. And those places are all wildly different, but they all have deep connections to nature. And so I think, I mean, Albuquerque was a little dry and hot for me, but other than that, I feel like I was able to really just dig into these amazing places and the amazing beauty of it all, and just this desperate desire to be in it and to protect it. And so that's part of why I've made a decision actually to start writing nature music, or music that explains science or communicates in some way, is because I'm hopeful that music can have a larger purpose than just, yay, we're in a concert hall. And I mean, I love that, right? I love being in a concert hall and I love hearing music, but I also feel like sometimes we can play to our audience. Quite literally, the same group of people who have the subscription to the series and just want it to be safe and tame. And it's not like my music is out there necessarily, but I want it to push people to think or feel something. So I'm going to use an example like the opera I did that was called Locust, right? Locust is the main hero. So who wants to love a locust? They're biblical plagues, and they're about famine. But I want people to understand the importance of the locust in an ecosystem, and to be able to potentially see a way into loving something like that. And also being responsible for it. So, taking a little cue from Haydn, for example, the locust comes in, and I ask the audience to play paper, like crepe paper, as part of the wings, right? So whenever she enters, there's that. But she's got this lush romantic sound. And so it's lush romanticism accompanied by the rattling of paper. And at the end of the opera, when we're talking about how she went extinct, because it's an environmental murder mystery, but the fact that she goes extinct, the understanding of that is done both through the plot and explaining the story, but also musically, because she disappears and people are left to rattle the paper, and it kind of puts a little bit of responsibility in your hands. This beauty is gone, and you're still making the wings sound, and then you die out as the audience members. And of course, it was humans that caused the death of the locust. And so
Right.
it's that idea that we are responsible, and there in your hands is the very thing that disappears. So I like to try to make people care about the environment, as well as music, of course.
Yeah. It is fun also, which doesn't take away from that, but maybe, hopefully helps it stick with people. I brought my dad to that opera, to the performance that I played on that one time in Laramie, and he just really enjoyed playing with his paper. I'm not gonna lie. It was a hoot for him.
Well, I
I
mean,
learned some stuff too from the pit.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, Nicole, like when people are involved a little bit, I know it's a little, I don't want it to be like cheesy, right? I can't abide a clap along, sing along, right? Ew, I hate that, and everyone hates that, right? But not everyone, but a lot of people get really uncomfortable. No one's going to fail at playing paper, right? And it involves people, and honestly, it's in a town like Laramie, people don't see opera. That's one of the few non-college operas that's ever happened there. And I think that idea that, keep the audience awake and participating makes for a more entertaining show. I mean, a whole hour of people singing at you in a way that you're not used to can be intimidating. And so I feel like it invited them into the performance too. And joy, I mean, you mentioned joy a little bit there. Joy is really important in our lives, right? Especially now that I'm dealing with my folks being ill. It's really so important to find joy and have it. And it's empowering. It's very important to have joy and fun.
You touched upon some very realistic and practical concerns. Very in touch with people who come in from other communities kind of miss out on that when they come to a place like Laramie. Maybe don't understand the beauty of the audience that they have there. You've told me some stories over the years, some pretty amusing ones. Cockroaches come to mind, but what was it like moving from the Rocky Mountain West to Oakland, to the Oakland area, to Northern California for grad school?
Um, one of these kids I grew up with lived there, and so I was able to room with her. So that felt like home in a certain
Hmm.
way. But then beyond that, well, Santa Cruz was amazing because it was so beautiful and so different from anything I'd ever been used to. And it was expensive. There was a lot of traffic. It kind of freaked me out because, the least populous state to the most populous state. Uh, but there was an excitement and an energy, right? And the same with Oakland. The problem with Oakland was, of course, as a grad student, what can you afford? So I lived in a not nice part of Oakland, and they could smell the sagebrush or something because within a year of less than a year, maybe a few months of moving there, I got robbed at gunpoint. I mean, I just
Oh.
think they could see it on me or smell it on me. Um, but and then I had to deal with some post-traumatic stress from that kind of thing. So it was a real mixed bag. Grad school's hard, as you all, I'm sure. Yes, everyone's nodding.
Yes.
Yes. Grad school is really challenging. And then to have it be expensive, you can't really afford it. Struggling, trying to find your place can be a challenge. And it was. It was a challenge. And at some point, I think after that robbery, sitting in traffic, I really just couldn't bear it anymore. And I turned on the radio for entertainment because I was bored of my own yodeling. Whenever I got stuck in traffic, I'd practice yodeling, but it never went well. But anyhow, I turned on the radio and Wide Open Spaces from the Dixie Chicks came on, and I was dealing with
Oh yeah.
poverty and my dissertation and an apartment with no heat and living in a really bad neighborhood. And I just started crying, and I was like, I'm going back to Wyoming.
Aw.
And did that happen soon after? I mean, like,
Yeah,
was that really the beginning of you thinking, yeah, I'm heading back?
yeah, it was. It
Wow.
was. It really was. I called up my old theory teacher who happened to be the department chair, and I said, "Is there anything there for me?" Because I was just writing my dissertation, and I really didn't have to be in California. And she said yes, and she gave me what I considered one of the best positions of my life for in the 20s with insurance.
Ooh, yeah.
I got to be called a composer in residence, and I came back to Wyoming. And that's when that sort of, you were talking before about the many jobs that happened. Um,
Hmm.
from music archives to music department part-time to women's studies part-time, then called women's studies, now gender and women's studies. Um, and eventually they got their tenure track position in composition and theory. And I was lucky enough to be a candidate and make it. Apparently, I hadn't angered anyone enough to not hire me yet at that point.
I can't imagine. Yeah, I mean, that would have been nuts to not hire you. It would have been nuts.
Um,
You and so in your time in Wyoming, you have really given back to Wyoming, I feel like. I mean, I'm trying to think of uh, another contemporary composer I know of who for whom your residence is such an important part of your musical identity. You've got several works inspired by Wyoming Voices, which was written in 2004. And you wrote the soundtrack to a 3-hour Wyoming public television documentary. I was going to ask if you were the official national composer of Wyoming, because Wyoming kind of feels like a country, but maybe that's too corny. But seriously, I'm curious about your time away from Wyoming, before coming back and being a student from, Podunk, USA, which I think many people experience. Were you writing about Wyoming as a student? Were you encouraged to do that or to embrace that part of your identity? Or is that something that you felt like you could do after you came back?
Yeah, the latter. While I was in grad school, I was constantly being pushed to be more modern,
Hmm.
to
Mm.
stop using
Mhm.
triads and be more modern and take myself seriously, they would say. That's how they would phrase these things. But,
Ouch.
that was a period in the 90s, right, where atonal was the only thing serious or some sort of modernistic something or other. Um, in the 80s, if you weren't writing 12 tone, you weren't something important. Or at least that's, yeah, I know. That's sort of the attitude that I was getting from various professors.
Mm.
And so I was doing my best to broaden, stretch myself, do what they were asking for, because after all, I was in grad school to absorb it all, right? But it was really kind of going against my grain a little bit. And there I was considered the tonal composer, and then I got to Wyoming and took a position teaching composition, and I was the atonal composer. So geography defines your sound, strangely enough. And I feel like I feel like once I was in Wyoming, m- I could almost like my heart could breathe and everything could breathe. And the wide open spaces really do make an impact on me. I mean, part of it is that I have ADHD, and so there's a craziness to a city that's really hard to deal with when you're, not when you're a little bit neurodivergent, right? That's just too much
Mm.
going on. And for me
Yeah.
to make lists and figure that all out, it was so complicated. And this is before we have cell phone maps, right? This is when we have to actually look at a map and memorize routes and try to figure out. I remember they'd give us free tickets in Santa Cruz to go to see the opera, which I loved. I'm sorry, Davis. They gave us a free ticket. I remember seeing Rigoletto, and I thought, stupid story, misogynistic. And then I get in the opera, and I'm like, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
the best. This is about father's love. So, but I also had to get there. I had to pay for parking. I had to not get towed, figure out the BART system. Oh no, the BART
Mm.
stops at 11, so you can't go to a long opera. Everything was harder. And so to come here and have that permission and have people really in love with Wyoming. I mean, Wyomingites are weirdly in love with Wyoming. So, I think just like Coloradans, right? Coloradans really love their state too.
I see you've been talking a little bit about sort of the more rural transplant in California.
Mhm.
I also came from a very rural background and did my master's in the Bay Area. So I'm hearing some familiar themes, although
Mm.
we, obviously had some variation for experience. And I don't know how to phrase this question with a person that I've only known for, 20 or 30 minutes at this point.
Mhm.
You you also mentioned some statements about your compositional style that I've often heard being delivered from primarily older male composers to particularly younger female identifying composers. And you've used a few phrases that I remember from my own time as the rural transplant in, on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Um, do you think any of that shaped your experience? You alluded to some work in the formerly women's studies, now gender studies department, and from my own time on university campuses. They're often very fun departments. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of those past experiences and ways that maybe your time in the gender studies program shaped how you view the world or those past experiences?
Sure. I mean, I think I've always been kind of really, I don't know why, but I've always been so acutely aware of um, how women don't necessarily get the same opportunities,
Sure.
and the older I get, the more subtle I see the pressure. Um, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
We can have a long conversation about this. But for example, I worked at UW and what at the time was a great job, $23,000 or whatever it was with benefits. And, the next year it was taken away. And then I had to do something. So that's why I went to the archives. And that's a sort of a long-term pressure where these little things that keep you from your tenure track job or whatever your job is going to be, and then your career takes another step backwards.
Sure.
And that happens a lot to women in lots of different ways. Like for example, I was working on an opera scenes about a geology. So the idea was that, a rock opera, ha ha ha.
Oh,
But
I love that.
we were anthropomorphizing these geological processes, right? But then the guy I was working on the opera with started to have a crush on me.
Ew.
And yeah, and it got weird and I just had to stop the progress. And if I had been working with someone who hadn't done that, I might have a nice rock opera right now.
Sure.
And those are the kinds of things where it's just pressure on women to not quite get ahead, right? And you have to do a detour. And it's not like I'm ever going to stop, right? I'm dedicated. I love what I do. But it's just stuff that I don't think that many men have to deal with. Now, in the women's studies department, I was teaching gender and what was the class called? Gender and humanities.
Hmm.
And so I got to dive into dance and music and theater and art, visual art, and I learned so much from a variety of friends and colleagues about some of the most fascinating work dealing with gender. And I feel like it was happening, 20 years ago before people were talking about gender and
Sure.
things were starting, things were already starting back then. And so it's really great to delve into that and have the opportunity to. But even that said, that was not a tenure track position nor a living wage in a supposedly feminist women's studies department.
Sure.
So can I ask you, is it okay to ask you?
Yeah.
Like what were your experiences from rural to urban in the Bay Area?
Well, I mean, so I'm from the South. And the little drum that I have been banging as an adult is, when people are talking about somebody saying something stupid, they default into a Southern accent. So there are some generalizations about the area that I'm from.
Mhm.
And because of, where I grew up and how I grew up, my exposure to the classical music world was limited.
Yeah.
I, grew up in a band background, and so I found myself on the West Coast where that's not a thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I legitimately didn't know the community that I was in. And a thing I've become more aware of, and a thing that I think I heard around the edges of you speaking, um, at the time I thought people weren't taking me seriously because I was young and because I didn't know the community as well. But as I
Mhm.
get older, I'm, starting to realize maybe I do know some things that I didn't give myself credit for at the time. And I wonder if it was more about where I was from. Could have been part of it, because that the Daisy May thing is real in a lot of people's minds. But I also wonder how much of it was gendered, because I still find that as a middle-aged lady, like, I'm not getting taken a lot more seriously, and I don't think it's lack of knowledge at this point. So
Right.
um yeah,
I had one professor call me Laramie. He wouldn't learn my name. He'd just say Laramie.
I
Oh
I
my
had
God.
one professor discover mid conversation, and I don't remember if we were in class or if it was after class, but I said something and it came out that I was from Tennessee, and he
Mhm.
sort of paused and turned his head sideways and said, "But you're so smart." So for those of you who can't see the visual camera, we're having a really great physical reaction. That's kind of how I feel about it. So, I mean, do you think that shaped your experience of the West Coast? Obviously, you had some super traumatic experiences that are not a part of my journey, but I wonder sometimes for myself about the pushback and how that experience might have been different for me if I had presented as a man or not been, a redneck or whatever. Like,
Right,
do you
right.
have, do you have thoughts on your version of that journey?
Well, I kind of do, and part of why I'm so, like the, composer of Wyoming or whatever is because I feel like more than my Italianness or, any other sort of parts, well, being a woman has a lot to do with it, but being a
Sure.
woman and being from Wyoming are things that I feel like have to be represented. So I almost want to achieve to be like, hey, we're not flyover land, you
Sure.
know? Hey, we matter. We have a really brilliant artist community here. I mean, look at Nicole right there and
Right.
and look at the kinds of things that are really honestly going on at Wyoming. And I won't promote any university administration these days, but I think that actual people doing the work are amazing. And there should be an ability, the whole country, to listen to the middle of the country. We do matter, and we aren't all rednecks or, yeehaws in our case, etc. That
Sure.
there's a real vital culture here. And yeah, the that comment is just inexcusable on your professor's part. Inexcusable.
I mean, one of many, and obviously
Right.
not something
Right.
that it makes a great anecdote now. Um,
But
but
you're so
Well, but I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm grateful that he said it. I'm not great with subtlety, and I think I've heard the edges of that in conversations with other folks. Like it's not
Mhm.
altogether uncommon to be having a conversation with another musician that knows me and respects me and clearly thinks that everyone from the South, is married to their cousin and does whatever it is that people think. Yeah. Anyway,
I'm gonna say, I think that Southern women are some of the most amazing women on the planet. I mean, we can look at like Dolly Parton and Jennifer Higdon, and there's so many awesome women from the South that have formed our culture. Black women too, like Ma Rainey or any of these, important blues singers. They're so important to our culture, and people just diss the South.
I think people diss the unfamiliar. So it's I always get a little excited when I get to talk to somebody who's from maybe a smaller community that ventured out into the big wide world,
Right,
to see
right.
what would happen. But anyway, sorry for the derail.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as you're talking, we started this conversation talking about creativity,
Hmm.
Sure.
freedom and creativity, and now we're talking about all the ways in which classical music and academic music, and I think both are really lacking in creativity sometimes. I mean, what a stupid kind of rigidity,
Hmm.
to say, oh, unless you're writing this kind of music, it's not weird enough, it's not difficult enough, so it's not valid. Or, oh, you can come here as a student, but you're probably going to be a dumb dumb and not belong here because you actually grew up in Tennessee. I mean, these kinds of things. It's interesting, we're starting to peel back the edges in certain select ways. I love the efforts to really promote female composers
Mhm.
on a larger scale than we've seen in the past. Not enough. And I would love a day when it stops being a thing that you have programmed a female composer and it's just another great composer, BIPOC composers, etc. But it's a first step to really start looking away from the dead straight white guys and see what else we missed out there.
Hmm.
But it's 2023
I know.
and
It's
it's
very
just
depressing.
it's just now happening. And I think I have felt fortunate to be at a school like University of Wyoming, maybe because we're not so big and fancy, we can experiment a little more and be a little bit more open. But the schools that I went to are still struggling, some of them, to play anything besides Beethoven and Mozart and prepare for your orchestral excerpts.
Yep.
So it's an odd dichotomy. I mean, we're artists, but what is it about classical music? I think jazz is this way too, or has become this way, where there are very rigid formulas, and if you don't fit into one of them, um, best of luck to you. It's very
I,
confusing for people.
it is, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head too. I mean, there's so much sort of as you said, rigidity in jazz and classical music in an academic setting. And there's a little more, I actually think there's a little more experimentation, like short operas, that there's so much wonderful experimentation going on in short opera. There are a lot of little tiny companies that are not famous across the nation that are doing really cool stuff that I want to go to. And that's when I miss urban. Like I really want to go to those things. That is cool. I think that also there's some small amounts of creativity in say summer festivals. Like I was just looking at Angel Fire. You know, they have a chamber music festival and they have a composer in residence, and it's Andy Akiho right now. And he's a cool composer, really interesting stuff going on. And he's there being a composer performer playing the pan, you know, the steel pans. And the whole festival, all festival long, there's women composers in the whole of the festival, and Andy is on nearly every concert. And I think that's really exciting for people because there's Mendelssohn, but there's also Akiho, you know? So you get this chance to have your comfort zone, but then reach out and broaden out. I was just up in the Tetons with a festival that I run called the Wyoming Festival. And it's where I invite a number of composers to write music about the Tetons and create sort of this, I don't know, school of nature composing or something. And you know, that's a music loving community, but there was a full audience jam packed into this little, you know, 100-seat room, people spilling out, and they're just avidly really interested in listening to modern music because it's about them, it's about their place.
Yeah.
They want to hear about how the lodgepole pine cone pops open, you know, written by a Brazilian composer. They want to know what the Brazilian thinks about their world, you know, and they want to know what I have to say. And that's thrilling and exciting to have that kind of creativity in what ought to be a really stodgy community, right? They get their Mendelssohn on the main festival. But here they are, thrilled and excited to learn a little science while hearing a concert. You were going to say something.
Oh, I have mixed feelings about thinking that communities ought to be stodgy. I found in some of the most rural areas where I've lived, people have been the most open. It's just about, well, and you can maybe speak to Wyoming more specifically, but I wonder, is it about preparing them in a way that sort of meets them where they're at to create that openness? Or why do you think they're so open? Let's make it a question.
That's a good question. I mean, the first thing is to know about this community. It's the richest county in the entire United States.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I said it ought to be stodgy, right?
Oh, okay.
Because they have the big donors for the concert hall and the Teton series and all that, right? You know, so that's why it ought to be whatever, quote unquote.
Got it.
But I think, I mean, maybe they're open-minded because it's held at a biological research station. And so already you're going to go have a barbecue with an amazing view in a historic district in a national park at a research station. So like, I think that kind of person who's going to bother to do that is going to be a little bit open anyway. So that might be it. We also have it very informal and we talk to the people. So my music director talks to people and says, read the notes, but let me tell you what it's like to be an insider on this music. And people really want to know what it's like to be a professional violinist and what they see in the music. And they can read our notes and hear what we see, and then they can talk to us afterwards and ask questions. So I think that communication element is really important.
What are the conversations with people after the performances like?
Oh, they're super cool. They're like, ooh, I didn't know I could like spiders. Your spiders are amazing, and I learned something. That's one of the composers, Monica Mendoza, did this really great piece. Nicole's student, who is an amazing composer, amazing. Anyhow, she wrote a piece about the mason spider. And so people learned how this spider works. It builds little nests by taking all sorts of diverse elements and sticking them in a pile. And that's how it makes a nest for its babies. And so that's kind of interesting and humorous and unlike what we think of spiders. And her piece was just marvelous because she took little bits of things and put them into a pile, and ta-da, it made music. So conversations like the spider scientist talking with other people, listening to the music and saying, well, what do they really do? Is that really what they're like? Yes, that's what they're like. Other conversations are things like, okay, there was a deer outside listening to the concert. It sat right outside the concert hall, or, the room. And
Aw.
the rangers were outside taking pictures of the deer listening to the music on the inside. It was just, it's just really an interesting place. And
Yeah.
people who come are interesting.
I love after concert audience conversations, and it
Yeah.
sounds like in an environment like that and with pieces about spiders, perhaps you provide even more interesting fodder for fun
I
conversation.
think, yeah, I think it's a little easier for people to access. If you don't read music, it's a little harder to have a conversation, or you're not a professional musician. But when you have a spider to let you ask you, well, what were those weird little slides you did? How did that happen? You get
Mm.
a sort of an interesting conversation flowing.
Well, and if it could sell a spider, I feel like it's probably got to be a pretty cool piece.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Well, Annie, I just got a hot tip recently about, well, I got contracted to play on a new piece of yours for tenor and orchestra that will be premiered at the Shepherd Symposium. Actually, by the time this episode comes out, it will have been premiered, and it was amazing. Can you tell us about it?
Well, I have at least 8 notes on the piano. Yeah, it just the the contract also just happened to me, so I just figured it out. Yeah, okay, I'm hesitant to say this because it might change, so take that as a caveat that this might change. But
Right.
I have this weird idea. Okay, we were talking about joy being important, right? And I think especially with queer folks, joy is very important. It's very powerful. We tend to get these what I call dysphoric narratives where in art and music we're always dying, right? Or getting hurt. And this is it was of course a terrible and tragic event, and no one anywhere should have to deal with what the Shepherd family has had to deal with. So I want to say that first. But I also want to say they have brought so much goodness into the world from this horrible beginning, right? Or ending,
Yeah.
right? So they have made such incredible additions to queer culture, queer communities, and not just queer cultures, right? They are so wonderfully transactional and transactional about making sure that they're getting rid of hate and increasing empathy. And so that felt inspiring to me. And I want to do something that mixes astrophysics and the Matthew Shepard story. And so my idea was to sing about how a star is born. And so with stars, I'm learning all this wonderful stuff. This is part of why I like to do this, is because I learn a ton. But with stars, dust gathers out in the universe. It's really spread out. It's not very much dust, but it starts to gather, and it builds a sort of a momentum. And then there's this really violent beginning, right? It collapses in on itself with so much gravity, and it gets so hot that a star is born. But what is a star but a thing that spins out light? And so I liked the metaphor of a violent, kind of horrible, destructive event that then spins out light for a long time. Not forever, but a long, long time is how long a star. And even after a star's gone, it spins out light. And so I'm doing a thing, timing is short on this one, right? This is I don't have very much time to get this done. So I have to
Yeah.
move. And so I read a bunch of articles about how a star was formed, and I'm going to take select ideas and sentences and mix them with select ideas from that time period, and then create a sort of a everlasting spinning into light. I think that's what I'm going to call it, spinning into light kind of a piece.
I can't wait.
We'll see. I'm not much of a poet, but I think I can get the story across anyway. I don't have time to hire a poet. Just do it. Right.
You left academia recently. Do you feel comfortable talking about that choice?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, there's two main reasons, and this touches on everything we've been talking about.
Mm,
Um, I'm the primary caretaker for my parents. I'm lucky that they're being taken care of to a certain extent by the care center, and my dad's pretty independent, so that's good. But I'm there for emergencies and for the all the little things that someone in their 80s needs, right? Which is lawns mowed and things gotten from the store, etc. And while I was doing that, I took my FMLA from the university when it was really bad, when I was really on as a caretaker. But after that and after COVID and all of the things that universities make you do, reports and papers and fill out this form on folio and do this, and even though you're tenured, argue for keeping your job. And it wasn't as much about the teaching. I love teaching. I love my students. I love your students, right? They're great people. But I was getting further and further away from composing and teaching. And those are the things that I love. And I probably could have and should have stayed another year running out my FMLA, but I just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. It feels, it's definitely unfair to women, and I can prove it with numbers, right?
mm,
It's definitely very political, and I'm terrible at that. And so, and I'm not just talking University of Wyoming. I'm sure it's every university, right?
yeah.
But at some point, I just couldn't take it anymore. I'm too sensitive, and my folks were taking up too much time, and I wanted to get back to composing. I'll miss my students. I really will. That
Yeah.
that hurts already.
Yeah.
But I can probably develop a studio. I just haven't done it yet because life's busy and complicated.
They will miss you too,
Yeah,
to be sure.
yeah.
So last time I talked to you, you had some potential plans, some potential ideas in the works. Do you have anything in the hopper that you'd like to share?
As far as
Days in
composition,
Laramie, or yeah, or just what, so maybe possibly a freelance studio. You
hmm
plan on staying in Laramie and composing freelance?
yeah, for the time being, I'm in Laramie. We'll see what happens with my folks.
Hmm.
I really love it here, but to be really honest, my spouse, he doesn't love it here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she doesn't like the cold, and she has found that academics are kind of mean.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
So, she's currently living in Aurora, Colorado, and so we sort of have a, cross the border thing going on. Um,
Right.
we get together as often as we can, and for now it's okay. We had talked about possibly moving to an artsy small town like Santa Fe or Boulder or something like that. I mean, Boulder's not small, but it's a lot more bearable for me than, say, Denver.
Right.
So, these are some ideas that are percolating. I love Wyoming. I will always love Wyoming, and I will always have a place here. I've decided that I will keep my basement apartment, this lovely shack that I live in, pretty much forever because I need and want to be here. It recharges me. But I may move on. We'll see. Depends on what opportunities arise.
Right. That you are not the first one whose wife can't handle the cold in Laramie. Even within the music department. Come to Laramie, folks. It's beautiful. It is beautiful, but
It is beautiful, and there are 4 months of the year where it's paradise.
and just get a good coat. It's okay. Yeah.
I tried. I got her a heated coat, There's so
I
many
thought she
things.
was from Wyoming. Am I misremembering that?
No,
Not Wyoming, Wisconsin, I mean.
she's actually from Kansas but
Oh.
calls Denver her home.
So we have two questions that we've been ending with. I'm going to ask the older one first. What are three things that you've been listening to lately?
Three things. I mean, I don't know if can I say three composers instead? Because
You
I don't
can.
know if I have
I mean,
three
we've
things.
had it's been all over the gamut from there was a Bjork phase where everybody was listening to Bjork for a minute. I
Oh,
think my answer
yeah,
was Nutcracker because we asked me right before Christmas and I was
right,
practicing. So like
right.
Whatever you got, throw it at us.
Okay. Well, I mean, this week I was listening to all these great composers who came to the Wyoming Festival and just so talented and wonderful, including one who got COVID and couldn't make it, but his name is
No, I don't know.
Delshawn Taylor, and he's from Denver. He's a wonderful composer and has recently been doing a lot of opera, but he's a vocalist, and I met him at the Wichita. I was teaching a little composers festival for Wichita Symphony.
Hmm.
And so I met him there and invited him to come to the Wyoming Festival. Just a glorious work called Basque, where just like a hug in nature. So a really beautiful piece. So and then my former students, Enrique Habelo and Monica Mendoza and Shauna Wolf, who was a student of mine many years ago. Those were some of the people that were at the festival this year. Just great composers. So that was glorious. Um, other composers, Nicole introduced me to Shauna Pepolo.
Oh,
And so I've been sort
Mhm.
of jumping into some of his work because I think he's a great composer, just a fantastic composer. I'm always trying to catch up on whatever Jennifer Higdon did most recently. I think she's wonderful. I love her music, and her voice is very true and very Jennifer Higdon. And then I always listen to Dolly Parton. I mean, if we're talking the Southerners, I'm always listening to, you know, and actually I started thinking I really missed out on the 70s. My dad didn't allow any rock music in the house, and there were some awesome singers like Linda Ronstadt, you know,
yes.
and I decided I needed to go on a 70s tour. So I've been listening to pop music of the 70s, but only with the great singers.
Awesome. So Linda Ronstadt, anybody else at the top of your mind or in the top of your
Well,
heart right now?
yeah, I think there's a lot of like the country singers actually of the 70s of
Okay.
of that era, the glitter and the whole step modulation in the middle, classic country stuff. You know? I was actually contemplating, is there a way I can do a whole step modulation in an orchestral piece and make it make sense and not cheesy? Who knows?
You mentioned Sean and Jennifer Higdon, both of whom I've interacted with in the last year or so, and both of whom were working on operas. I'm not clear if those are out yet. Were you doing research or was this just to fill your soul?
Yeah, no, not doing research, just to fill my soul.
Soul.
Yeah, no,
Awesome.
no,
Awesome. Those are two great things to fill your soul with, in my
yeah.
humble opinion. Our last question is one that we've been kind of sticking with here in the second half of our season. Um, do you have a dream project or collaboration? So the way that I'm sort of broaching this is if you could manifest the thing you've always wanted to do and somebody were to call you tomorrow, who would it be and what would they want?
It would be Santa Fe Opera, and it would be a full-length opera of my choosing. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think I'd want to work with someone like what's her name? Erdrich, sorry. Doing like the some sort of naturey drama, something about nature science, something climatey, something that would like hopefully push people to think about, saving the planet.
Awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And
Cool.
they'd
Well,
be nice
you were
paycheck.
ready. You were ready with that answer. That was very specific.
Yeah, well, opera
Like
is
it.
so fun. It communicates with so many people, and I think I don't know. That's just a dream.
Santa Fe Opera, if you're listening.
Can I throw in a tag ending since you mentioned Sean? Because this is a cherished memory for me, actually, Annie. Um, a year, or I don't know, I don't remember what year it was, 2017, maybe
Like that.
2018. I played on a poem, his solo piece on a poem on my faculty recital. And I reached out to him to let him know, listeners, if you don't already know this, always try to track down your composers, purchase the music directly from them, tell them that you're going to play the piece ahead of time, share a program with them afterwards for their records. And so I reached out to Sean and I told him that I was doing this ahead of time. And he said, oh boy, I've never been to Wyoming. And I have travel money from my school and I'm going to see if I can get to Wyoming because I'd really like to be there. I mean, it's like just a dumb old faculty recital I'm giving, but it was an opportunity. And we have this sometimes at UW, right? Just the exoticism of Wyoming. Like,
Right.
I got to see if it's really a state. And so, but he needed something to do, compositionally speaking, he needed to work with the students somehow in order to justify getting his travel money. And so I reached out to Annie, and as you have done in the past, as always, you were extremely welcoming and said, absolutely, I'll give him a class, So Sean's at my recital, you came to my recital, and then afterwards we went out. Sean doesn't drink. So this was a little bit different from our usual old hangs, Annie, but we went for tea instead of beers. We went to Night Hair and Bookshop and we went for tea. And Chi-Chen Wu, the pianist who had played with me, was also with us. And so we were kind of sitting there talking shop about the recital. And you, Annie, you and Sean were just the most delightful sight in that bookstore. I mean, you were just talking shop, and sometimes Chi-Chen and I would drift off into conversation, and all of a sudden Sean would let out this whoop of laughter and people would turn around and you two would just be giggling up a storm. And it was just the most beautiful sight watching the two of you make friends. I loved it. I still think about that.
Well, okay. So first of all, it's not just a faculty recital. Nicole's recitals are amazing. They're always great.
Well, thank you. I pay you to say that.
Yeah, no, you did not. This is a free interview. So that's the first thing. But that is the one thing I will say that's not great is I don't get a lot of collaborations with other composers because there's not that many of us here. There's a
Right.
few in the state, maybe a handful, a half a dozen sort of serious, quote unquote, serious composers. And so, we're not getting together and talking. That said, are composers really all that friendly to each other? Not always. Sometimes there can be an attempt to grab more of the pie than the other person. So it was a delight to talk to Sean because he was really kind and collaborative and a true gentleman. He's a really great guy as well as a wonderful composer.
Well, you two were a nice match then.
Well, thank you.
Well, Annie, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great talking to you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much, and I appreciate you doing this whole series. Your podcasts are great, so thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.